In the manor house.
Oh, in the manor house, yes. That's where Mr. and Mrs. Taylor lived. And when we lived on the farm, they used to refer to that as the big house. It was never called the manor house until the town purchased it. Prior to that, it was called the big house. And that's where Mrs. Taylor lived, and it was a lovely place, and she used to have steps that were cut into grass and a reflecting pool which they filled in, and beautiful, beautiful gardens and statuary. And daffodils, my goodness. One day I came up from Sandy Point Beach, and I came in to see my mom into my house, and I had a bouquet of daffodils about this big around. And my mother almost fainted, and she asked me where I had got them. And, of course, I picked them from Mrs. Taylor's garden all the way up through the Glen, which I was not supposed to do. I'm going to tell you one other thing about the winters at the Glen and living in this house that I remember. We had coal heat, okay? And there were many drafts in this house because it's an old house, and it's not insulated like our houses are today. So they used to come and bank the houses, what they call bank the houses, and which meant they would build a frame all the way around the house. The foundation, and they would put leaves in it, and then on the top of that they would put slats of wood so that the wind wouldn't blow the leaves away. And it helped to keep some of the heat in the house. And they were really fun to walk on.
Which you weren't supposed to do. Yes, because I can remember going down to meet Dad on Sunday when he did his chores, and this is way back when he was a herdsman, and he milked the cows with another man. He had chores, they called them. Every day, but on Sunday he still had to do it. And I'd go down with my mother. This was before Jerry was born, and Barbara. And we'd walk down the drive here with my mother and my next to the oldest sister, and go down and go in the cow barn and watch them bring the cows in and watch them milk the cows. And we'd visit the bulls quite a distance away. Yes, always.
Of course, at that time, I lived closer to the barn, so I used to love to go up in the haylofts. I used to crawl the ladders, and I'd go up into the haylofts, and I had a bad fall one time because they had removed some bales of hay from the middle of the hayloft, and of course I didn't know that, and I really was not supposed to be up there. And I used to visit the bulls. I used to have big bulls in the bullpen, and ride my bike. And we used to make camps up in the woods, pretend camps, and make pretend little pieces of dishes and stuff like that. And my sister and I used to plant moss gardens. And then one day when I was older and I was able to drift a little bit further, I found this barn here down in the middle of a field, which became my clubhouse. And this is still there today. If you go down Glen Road and you go to where the 4-H...
At the end of Glen Park?
Right. Yeah. Thank you. This is still there, and it used to be my clubhouse. There used to be just an old plow downstairs, and this upstairs used to be my clubhouse. So I could pass this around. Mr. Taylor passed away. He died. And Mrs. Taylor remarried a Mr. Nicholson. And they used to have a black Cadillac that they used to drive around the Glen in, a very, very expensive car. And he didn't like my other sister that was also born in this house, who is no longer here. He didn't like us on the stone wall. But when he saw us walking on the stone wall, he would tell us to get off, and he'd give us a quarter. So guess what we did every time we saw that car come? We got up on the stone wall, that's right, and we get a quarter. Wasn't that funny? Talk about that hospital barn for a minute. It's probably very difficult to imagine a barn being a hospital, but it was spotless. There were many, many beds in it, and they even had a little section set up for an operating room with everything there where they could perform an operation. It was really amazing, and it was, I think, one of the nicest things she probably did for the war effort, although she did many, many, many things. But that was one of them that was very special that I remember hearing now and then. You know, some of the cows used to get out of the fields or something, and my dad would call the herdsman, and usually they were able to obviously get them back into the field. But that was funny because, you know, every once in a while you'd be driving along and there would be a cow in the road, and you'd think to yourself, I don't think a cow belongs in the road, you know. Maybe he's lost his way or something. But they were usually able to get them back in the field. I'll tell you another quick interesting story about cows and all. When I was a little girl, they used to move the cows from field to field, and the only way they had to do it was to bring them down through the roads and what have you. So my dad would tell my mom, we're going to stampede the cows today. Yeah, that's keep the girls inside. So we'd have to stay in the house, and all of a sudden you'd hear this, you know, and you'd look out, and there would be the cows going from one field to another, and it was quite interesting. But they had to move them from field to field so that they would, you know, be able to eat the grass and whatever else they ate.
A big fire in one of the horse barns down here. I don't really remember what caused it. Sometimes it could have been a combustion it's caused, but because they used to store the hay in the hay loss, and when it gets very, very hot, it could have started itself. I don't really remember what caused it, but they did have quite a large fire. There were no animals in it at the time. It was a horse barn, and here on the farm they had their own fire engine. It was much smaller compared to the fire engines that we have today, and the men on the farm were the ones that operated it. But that's the worst thing that I can remember. For the Second World War, and before 1941, and before Pearl Harbor. Oh yes, this is the team, and this was the farm team, and that was the garden team. That's the only names that they had. These were the men that worked on the farm itself. They're the ones that did the farm work and took care of the animals. And these men here were the ones that worked in the garden and the greenhouses. And this is where they raised flowers and plants of all kinds, including orchids, for them to use at the big house or the manor house. Beautiful flowers. And these young men were the ones that worked there, and they also took care of mowing the grass and keeping the land really pretty, and they took care of the landscapes down at the manor house too. But each one had their job, and they only played each other. They didn't play any outside. We had a Red Cross house, which is the next house down here, that Mrs. Taylor let them use to roll bandages and knit. And, well, you were too young, weren't you? And we were given hats, and I still have the pin. And my sister and I went down and we rolled bandages for the military, for them to use for any of the men that were wounded. And we had a great time. And this was on Saturdays, and anybody could come. It was simply volunteer. And that was Mrs. Nichols. They also grew potato fields, and these potatoes were donated to the military for the soldiers and the sailors, the Marines, and that was another thing that Mrs. Taylor gave to the military.
Well, you know, when I look back on living there, I think we were very rich. We never wanted for anything. We had everything. Christmas and holidays were big affairs, you know, and it was a family family oriented. I mean, we were with my mother's sister all the time and my father's family all the time, you know, and people on the farm.
Yeah.
You remember one summer when she had fireworks down on the lawn of the big house, and everybody that lived on the farm and their families attended, and it was quite a spectacular thing.
Yes, the Taylors treated us very, very, very well. Yes, we used to get Christmas gifts from them and Easter gifts from them, and let's see.
Turkeys and baskets.
Oh, turkeys at Christmas time and big baskets, and when we lived in the houses, they were rent free, and my dad even got a salary, and they paid him up until the time he died, which was at the age of 91. So they continued to pay him even after he retired at the age of 85. He worked on the Glen for 65 years. So they were very, very generous, very, very kind, and not only that, they were. You could talk to them and visit with them, and they were very, very nice people.
I heard stories when I worked there from Camara. And one winter, I guess things were tight. There was not much work around outside the farm, and the foreman went to Taylor and said he's going to have to lay off 50 guys. And Taylor told him, if you can't find those guys work for the winter, you're fired.
Oh.
Mrs. Taylor died. The farm was inherited by her son Reginald, and he was already getting elderly. My dad was still working here, and there were just a few men. And by this time, they were renting some of the barns out for people who had horses, and they had bridle paths where they could ride. But the animals, like the cows and the sheep and chickens and so forth, I imagine they were probably sold off, because there was no longer any need for them. And since Mrs. Nicholson had died, and Mr. Reggie died shortly. Well, he was here for a while, but he lived in Buffalo, and it was my dad that was in charge. But there were fewer and fewer men, and so there was no one here to take care of the animals.